I think that any type of artist is really missing out if they only learn from other artists of their same type. So for example, as songwriters, sure, we can only learn from other songwriters and how people songwrite, but I think we're missing out if we don't investigate how other artists do their craft, because often we can learn a lot from other types of artists. I would compare this to how back in the day, the MLB, Major League Baseball, if you don't know, basically got really into analytics in baseball and utilizing that to inform their decisions as a league, specifically one team. But that carried over into now the NFL does that a lot. And then even other leagues are starting to get into it. So the NFL, even though it's a football league, learned from how general managers in the baseball league did things. In the same way, we as songwriters can learn from other types of artists. So in this video, we are going to talk about what songwriters can learn from painters. The first thing that I think we as songwriters can learn from painters is thinking about what is in frame and what isn't. So when you are making a painting, you of course have to choose exactly how much you are showing, right? Are we talking about a whole landscape? Are you showing a whole series of mountains? Or are you simply showing one part of a person's face, and why? Why is it that you choose to only show one half of their face? Why is it that you choose to cut off the painting at halfway up the mountain, right? These are all choices you have to make, and as a painter, you have to make them intentionally. In the same way as songwriters, we have to make a similar decision, which is we only have something like 200 words, maybe 300 words, 400 words if our song is pushing it, to work with in the scheme of our song. So we really need to concentrate on what is quote unquote in frame in our song, which is just talking about what is it we will actually say in our song. We can't afford to have lines that are throwaway lines. We can't afford to have side quests in our song. We really need to make sure that we are communicating exactly what we want to. We need to make sure every detail in our lyrics matters, because otherwise we're going to get totally lost and our song is going to have no sense of identity, because again, we only have 200 or 300 words to work with usually. So we need to make sure that every single one of those words is really dedicated to getting the point across that they need to, and that they're not giving extra details that don't matter, because there isn't time for that. We need to make sure that we're controlling what exactly is in frame in our lyrics and what isn't. So just as an example of how not to do this, Hey Soul Sister by Train, which is a lyrical complete mess. But one example of something they talk about, which is basically just to force a really terrible rhyme. There's a lot wrong with that lyric, but they talk about how his heart is going to beat out of his untrimmed chest. Untrimmed chest is the dictionary definition of unnecessary information. That's also just bad information. Nobody wants to know that. Untrimmed chest doesn't add anything to the song. The main point of that line, my heart's going to beat out of my untrimmed chest, you could literally take out untrimmed chest completely, or certainly untrimmed, and it doesn't change anything about the song. If anything, it just makes the imagery a lot less needlessly disgusting. Another thing that we can learn from painters is controlling sharpness, controlling what is sharp and what is fuzzy. Because unlike photographers, which are somewhat limited by lenses, when it comes to painters and paintings, they can actually control that the person that is, half their face is half the painting versus the person that's a tiny little dot in the distance. They can still choose to actually make them equally detailed, unlike a photographer who probably can't do that because they're limited by the lenses. So as a painter, you can control exactly what's in focus, what's fuzzy, and you can make that decision intentionally. So in the same way, we as songwriters can and should be making those decisions intentionally. What type of details do we leave out? Which ones are very important? For example, we might tend to be more sharp and more detailed in the verses. That way we give a very clear image of what this story is. Maybe you're getting your heart broken at a coffee shop. That's maybe details that will help in the verse. But usually when it comes to the chorus, for example, we want to be more about bigger ideas and not be talking about very specific scenery as much, because the chorus is really where everybody should join in and be able to relate. So while your verse can maybe get away with talking about how you're in love with a redhead with brown eyes, the chorus should probably be something that's more applicable to everybody. But you might not actually choose to do that. And again, as long as it's intentional, I think that's fine. While it's generally true that choruses tend to apply to more people than verses, verses tend to be more specific, that doesn't have to be the case. So there really is no rules to what should be fuzzy and what should be more sharp, but we should be intentional about whether we are being more clear and more sharp and more focused, or if we're being more fuzzy about certain elements of the song. So let's take two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum examples. On one end, we have every single boy band song. You may or may not have noticed that every boy band song is basically designed so that every single girl in the audience could think that that song was written about her. They'll never talk about details. They'll never talk about what color eyes she has that makes her beautiful, or anything about her features that make her beautiful, or anything about like her hair color or anything like that. Why? Because they want every girl in the audience to be able to be like, oh, he's talking about me. And the second that he says brown hair, now, half or more of the audience is like, oh, well, it's not about me. And then they wouldn't have their posters on their wall and blah, blah, blah. So that's one end of the spectrum. Very, very, very fuzzy, and intentionally so. But on the other end of the spectrum, you can get way too detailed, giving the imagery to sort of convey we're sort of at this coffee shop. That might be good amount of detail. But if you go even steps further and you start talking about how you got a dark roast coffee and you made sure it didn't have any creamer or sugar in it and all that kind of stuff, who cares? Nobody cares. That's not important. You only have 200 words to communicate what we're trying to communicate. You don't have time for that. So we should be controlling exactly where between those two extremes. I would say, generally speaking, those two extremes are not super good. We want to be somewhere in the middle generally, but you want to control exactly where you are at what part of the song. So maybe, for example, you want to be sharp and specific early on in the song when you're giving sort of imagery and the setting so that people have a clear image of where this is happening and exactly what the scene is. And then from there, you can afford to be more generic because the scene is already set. You don't have to keep saying, hey, we're still in a coffee shop. Hey, we're still in a coffee shop. But be sure to be intentional about what is more fuzzy and what is more sharp, because they can have totally different effects. And another thing that songwriters can learn from painters is how to give the illusion of something being three-dimensional that is actually literally two-dimensional. So just like how painters only have a 2D canvas and yet they can convey 3 dimensions, we can do the same thing with our music. In fact, if we think from more of a recording arrangement standpoint, if you just think of wearing headphones, really all there is left and right. What is playing out of the left speaker and the right speaker? And we can give the illusion of things being farther away or closer and more intimate just by how things are arranged, how they're performed, what the instrument part is like, right? So if I sing a louder part where I'm singing high up and I back away from the mic as I'm singing, that will sound more distant, and that will sound like something maybe somebody singing from a mountaintop. Whereas if I'm singing a low part and I'm intimate and I'm like 2 inches away from the mic, and maybe there's just an acoustic guitar that's playing along with me, so that it sounds like you're basically sitting at a fireplace and the person is right next to you singing you this song, compared to a huge arrangement that sounds like it's being blasted out of an arena and you're way far in the back and yet it's still loud and it's basically arena rock type stuff. And the main idea here is just as songwriters, and specifically in the arrangement process, if we're doing that specifically for our recordings, or even just figuring out what our instrument parts will actually be when we perform them, all of those things can inform how the song feels in 3 dimensions. Even though, again, technically it's 2 dimensions. You can make something sound like it's farther away or closer and more intimate. You can make something sound like it is coming from the far back left of the room versus the far back right, versus being something that is right in front of the person's face. We can give that illusion of 3 dimensions, even though we're really working with a fairly 2-dimensional audio space when it comes specifically to recording. So hopefully you found this helpful, and if you did, something else you'll probably find helpful is my free guide on 10 different ways to start writing a song. I think this is really important for both people who are new to songwriting for obvious reasons and people who are not new to songwriting, because often the reason we get into creative ruts, in my opinion, at least in my experience, is that we try to keep writing songs from the same standpoint. I can't tell you how many people I know that literally will just not even consider writing a song in any other order other than start with a guitar and a chord progression. They will always start a song that same exact way, when really they might actually be more creatively fresh and be more invigorated creatively if they just changed it up sometimes. And that could be changing up what instrument you start with, or maybe instead of grabbing the guitar and doing a chord progression, maybe just coming up with a bass line on the low string of the guitar, or starting to write a different type of instrumental part rather than just a regular chord progression, starting with a melody instead, maybe starting on the lyrical side of things instead of the musical side of things. And that can look a whole bunch of different ways too. Sometimes you can just come up with a song title that you think is cool and then be like, what would this song be about? This is an interesting concept that I want to flesh out. Or maybe you think of a really cool image you want to build your song around and really have your song hammer home this interesting imagery that you came up with. There are so many different ways to start writing a song that will inspire you in different directions so that you stay creatively fresh, which I think is super important and at least is super helpful to me personally and my creative journey. So hopefully it will be helpful to you as well. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check it out. Link in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.